Hi, I'm Kira Delacroix. 3 months ago, I returned from a work trip to find the locks changed on my childhood home. My parents stood on the porch with their arms crossed, telling me I was no longer welcome. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They believed I'd stolen money from the family winery, that I'd sabotaged my sister's wedding, that I was nothing but trouble they needed to cut loose. What they didn't know was that the house they were barring me from, the one they'd lived in for 32 years, wasn't actually theirs. It was mine. And when they found out, everything changed. The Oregon coast in early October carries a particular kind of melancholy, the way the fog rolls in thick and silver off the Pacific, swallowing the lighthouse on Beacon Point until only its beam cuts through the mist. I'd always loved coming home to Ashworth Bay during this season, when the summer tourists had departed and the town belonged to its locals again. The Victorian houses along Lighthouse Hill Drive stood like patient sentinels, their painted ladies, facades weathered but dignified, holding secrets behind their bay windows and wraparound porches. I pulled my rental car into the circular driveway of number 47, the house where I'd grown up, where my grandmother had lived before us, where 3 generations of Delacroix women had planted roses and dreamed dreams. The house looked the same as always, its sage green siding freshly painted, the white trim pristine, the copper gutters gleaming despite the autumn rain. My mother had always been meticulous about appearances. Something felt wrong the moment I stepped out of the car. The front door, usually thrown open in welcome when I visited, remained firmly shut. The porch swing where my grandmother used to read to me sat empty and still. Even the air seemed different, charged with intention I couldn't name. I'd been in Seattle for 2 weeks, working on a historic preservation project for the city, and had texted my parents that I'd be home Tuesday evening. They'd responded with a simple acknowledgement, nothing more. I walked up the familiar stone steps, my architect's eye automatically noting the way the foundation had settled slightly on the east side, how the original 1890s craftsmanship still held strong after more than a century. The brass knocker, shaped like a ship's anchor, felt cold under my fingers. Before I could use it, the door swung open. My father stood there, but not the way he usually greeted me. No warm smile, no immediate hug, no questions about my trip or my work. Marcus Delacroix was a man who'd built his life on precision, first as a civil engineer, then as the owner of Delacroix Vineyards. Everything about him was measured, from his pressed khakis to his carefully trimmed beard. But today, something wild flickered behind his steel-gray eyes. "Kira," he said, my name falling flat between us like a stone. "Dad." I shifted my overnight bag to my other shoulder, suddenly feeling like a stranger on my own doorstep. "Is everything okay? You look... We need to talk." He stepped back, but not an invitation. It was more like he was creating distance. All of us. The hallway beyond him was dim, the afternoon light filtered through the stained glass window, at the landing casting jeweled shadows on the hardwood floor. This was the hallway where I'd learned to walk, where I'd slid down the banister despite my mother's scolding, where I'd sat on the bottom step every morning waiting for the school bus. Now it felt like walking into a courtroom. In the living room, my mother sat rigidly on the velvet sofa that had been my grandmother's favorite piece. Delphine Delacroix had always been beautiful in that effortless way that came from good bones and better breeding. But today her face was carved from marble, all sharp angles and cold surfaces. Her dark hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features, and her hands were folded in her lap with the kind of precision that spoke of barely contained emotion. My sister Celeste perched on the edge of the armchair like a bird ready to take flight. At 28, she was 2 years younger than me, but had always carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her place in the world. Her blonde hair cascaded in perfect waves over her shoulders, and her engagement ring caught the light as she twisted it around her finger. The wedding was supposed to be in 3 weeks, a lavish affair at the family vineyard that had been planned for over a year. Tristan, my younger brother, leaned against the fireplace mantel with his arms crossed. At 24, he'd inherited our father's height and our mother's sharp features, but none of their discipline. His dark hair was deliberately tousled, his expensive sweater wrinkled, his expression somewhere between boredom and irritation. He'd been the baby of the family for so long that he'd never quite learned to take anything seriously. "Sit down." "Kira," my father said, gesturing to the chair across from the sofa. It was positioned like an interrogation seat, isolated from the rest of the family grouping. I remained standing. "What's this about?" "Money," Celeste said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Specifically, money that's missing from the vineyard accounts." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually took a step backward, my bag sliding off my shoulder to land with a soft thud on the Persian rug. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play innocent," Tristan said, his voice carrying that lazy drawl he'd perfected in college. "We found the transfers. Your name, your account number. $50,000 moved over the past 6 months." I looked from face to face, searching for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, a joke, anything but what it appeared to be. But their expressions were uniform in their coldness, their certainty. "I didn't take any money. I don't even have access to the vineyard accounts." "You had access," my mother said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of disappointment. "When you helped with the books last Christmas, you said you wanted to understand the family business better." The memory came back in a rush. I'd been home for the holidays, and my father had been overwhelmed with year-end accounting. I'd offered to help, to input some of the vendor payments and organize the receipts. It had been a gesture of goodwill, a way to contribute to the family business even though my career had taken me in a different direction. I'd never imagined it would be used against me. "I helped with data entry," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I never had independent access to move money anywhere." "The evidence says otherwise," Celeste said, pulling out her phone and swiping to what looked like a bank statement. "These transfers, they're all marked with your digital signature." I moved closer to look at the screen, and my blood ran cold. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There it was, clear as day. Electronic transfers from Delacroix Vineyard's operating account to an account number I didn't recognize. And yes, my name was attached to each transaction, my employee ID from the temporary access I'd been given during the holidays. "This isn't possible," I whispered. But even as I said it, I could see how it looked. How perfectly it had been orchestrated to point directly at me. "It's not just the money," my mother said, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "Celeste told us about Preston. Preston Beaumont, Celeste's fiancé, was everything my parents had ever wanted in a son-in-law. Old money, old family, old connections that stretched back through generations of Pacific Northwest society. His family owned a shipping company that had made them wealthy beyond measure, and his trust fund was large enough to ensure that Celeste would never want for anything. He was handsome in that bland, symmetrical way that looked good in wedding photos and country club directories." "What about Preston?" I asked, though I was beginning to see the shape of this trap closing around me. "He told me about your conversation at the engagement party," Celeste said, her voice trembling with what I assumed was hurt but might have been rage. "How you cornered him in the wine cellar, how you tried to kiss him, how you told him he was making a mistake marrying me." The engagement party. It had been held at the vineyard in July, a glittering affair with white tents and string lights, and more champagne than a small country could consume. I remembered talking to Preston that night, but not the conversation Celeste was describing. I'd found him in the wine cellar, yes, but he'd been on his phone, arguing with someone in hushed, angry tones. When he'd seen me, he'd quickly ended the call and asked me not to mention it to Celeste. He'd seemed shaken, worried, Nothing like the confident man who'd toasted his future bride just hours earlier. "That's not what happened," I said, but I could hear how weak it sounded, how defensive. Preston was upset about something, a phone call. I asked if he was okay, and he asked me not to tell Celeste because he didn't want to worry her before the wedding. "So you admit you were alone with him," Tristan said, as if he'd caught me in a lie. "In the wine cellar of our family's vineyard, for maybe 5 minutes while he was clearly distressed about something." I looked at Celeste, pleading with her to see reason. "Why would I do what you're accusing me of? Why would I jeopardize your happiness?" "Because you've always been jealous," she said. And the words came out with such conviction that I wondered if she'd been rehearsing them. "Jealous that I found someone who loves me, jealous that I'm getting married, jealous that I'm happy." "That's not true, isn't it?" My mother's voice cut through the air like a blade. "When's the last time you brought someone home, Kira? When's the last time you seemed happy about anything other than your work?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable because it was designed to be. How do you prove you're not jealous? How do you defend against an accusation that's built on the absence of evidence rather than its presence? "I've been focused on my career," I said weakly. "That doesn't mean I'm jealous of Celeste's life." "And that career," my father said, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, cold and cutting. "Building restoration, historic preservation, playing with old buildings while the rest of us work in the real world." The dismissal in his voice was like a physical slap. I'd spent years building my reputation as an architect specializing in historic preservation, had worked on projects from San Francisco to Portland, had been featured in Architectural Digest for my work restoring a 19th-century mansion in the Columbia River Gorge. But in this room, surrounded by my family's judgment, it all seemed suddenly small and pointless. "My work is important," I said, but the words sounded hollow even to me. "Is it?" Tristan asked. "Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you're just avoiding growing up, avoiding real responsibility. The kind of responsibility that includes not stealing from your family," Celeste added. "I didn't steal anything." The words came out louder than I'd intended, echoing off the high ceilings and tall windows. "I would never." "We've made our decision," my father said, his voice final as a judge's gavel. "The money needs to be returned, and you need to leave." The words didn't make sense at first. Leave what? The conversation? The room? But then I saw the way they were all looking at me, the uniform coldness in their expressions, and I understood. "You're kicking me out," I said, and it wasn't a question. "We're protecting our family," my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And our business." "I am your family." "Are you?" Celeste asked, and there was something almost triumphant in her voice. "Because family doesn't steal. Family doesn't try to destroy each other's happiness." I looked around the room, at the faces of the people who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework and celebrated my graduations. But the people looking back at me were strangers, their expressions closed and hostile, their verdict already rendered. "I need you to pack whatever you need and go," my father said. "Tonight." "Go where?" I asked, though I knew it didn't matter. They weren't offering alternatives. "That's not our problem anymore," Tristan said, his voice casual, almost bored. I bent to pick up my bag, my hands shaking despite my efforts to stay composed. "Fine," I said, though the word caught in my throat. "But when you figure out what really happened, when you realize you've made a mistake, don't expect me to just come running back." "We won't," my mother said, and the finality in her voice was like a door slamming shut. I walked out of that living room, through the hallway where I'd learned to walk, past the stained glass window that had painted rainbows on my childhood. Mornings, I climbed the stairs to my old bedroom, where my teenage diary still sat in the desk drawer, where my collection of architecture books still lined the shelves, where the window still looked out over the rose garden my grandmother had planted. I packed quickly, mechanically, stuffing clothes and toiletries into my overnight bag without really seeing what I was choosing. My hands moved on autopilot while my mind reeled, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how my life had collapsed so completely in the space of 20 minutes. As I zipped the bag closed, my fingers brushed against something tucked into the side pocket. I pulled it out, my heart stopping when I recognized the yellowed envelope with my name written in my grandmother's careful script. I'd forgotten it was there, had carried it in this bag for months without remembering. Inside was a letter I'd to her, read a dozen times since her death 3 years ago, words that had comforted me through difficult days and uncertain moments. But tonight, one paragraph seemed to glow on the page like it had been written in fire. My dearest Kira, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. But I want you to know that everything I've built, everything I've saved, has been for you. The house on Lighthouse Hill Drive, the one where I raised your father and where you've grown into the remarkable woman you are today, belongs to you now. I've made sure the deed is in your name, filed with the county, unbreakable and clear. Your parents may live there, but it's your inheritance, your security, your home. Never let anyone take that from you. I read the words again, then again, my hands trembling as the meaning sank in. The house. The house where my parents had just thrown me out, where they'd stood on the porch like guards, where they'd made me feel like an unwelcome stranger. It was mine. Had been mine for 3 years, though I'd never thought to question the living arrangements, had never needed to assert ownership of something that had always just been home. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the envelope, then slipped it into my jacket pocket. My grandmother had given me more than just a house. She'd given me leverage, power, a way to fight back against the people who thought they could erase me from their lives with a few false accusations and a slammed door. But I didn't go downstairs to confront them, not yet. Instead, I walked to the window and looked out over the garden, over the town that had shaped me, over the life I was about to leave behind. The fog was rolling in from the ocean, thick and concealing, and I could hear the distant moan of the lighthouse horn warning ships away from the rocky shore. I had a choice to make. I could fight this, could stay and battle for my reputation and my place in the family, or I could walk away, could start over somewhere else, could build a new life without the weight of their expectations and disappointments. But as I stood there in the growing darkness, watching the fog swallow the familiar landmarks of my childhood, I realized there was a third option. I could let them think they'd won. I could disappear into the night like they wanted, let them believe they'd successfully erased me from their lives. And then, when they least expected it, when they'd grown comfortable in their victory, I could remind them exactly who owned the ground they stood on. I picked up my bag and walked downstairs, through the hallway, past the living room where their voices still murmured in satisfied tones. The front door closed behind me with a soft click, and I walked to my rental car without looking back. As I drove away from Lighthouse Hill Drive, my childhood home growing smaller in the rearview mirror, I wasn't running from a fight. I was choosing my battlefield. The fog closed in around me as I drove through the empty streets of Ashworth Bay, past the darkened shops and restaurants, past the harbor where fishing boats bobbed at their moorings like sleeping birds. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan beyond getting through the night, but I wasn't afraid. For the first time since I'd walked into that living room, I felt something other than shock and hurt. I felt powerful. 3 months later, I would stand in that same living room, but the dynamics would be completely different. They would be the ones looking uncertain, the ones scrambling to understand how their carefully constructed narrative had crumbled. They would be the ones facing accusations, the ones whose futures hung in the balance. But that night, driving through the fog toward an uncertain future, I was just a daughter who'd been cast out by her family, carrying nothing but a bag of clothes and a letter that would change everything. I didn't know it yet, But I was about to discover just how strong I could be when I had nothing left to lose. The motel room smelled like industrial bleach and desperation. I sat on the edge of a bed that sagged in the middle, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a map of somewhere I'd never been. The neon sign outside flickered erratically, casting the room in alternating shades of pink and darkness, and the ice machine down the hall groaned like an animal in pain every few minutes. I'd driven south from Ashworth Bay in a kind of trance, letting muscle memory guide me along Highway 101 until I found myself in Brookings, a small coastal town I'd passed through countless times but never really seen. The Seaside Motor Inn was the kind of place that asked no questions as long as you paid in cash, and the clerk behind the bulletproof glass had handed me a key without even looking up from his crossword puzzle. Now, 3 hours later, I was still, wearing the same clothes I'd put on that morning in Seattle, back when my biggest concern was catching my flight home. My overnight bag sat unopened on the dresser, and my phone lay face down on the nightstand, silent since I'd turned off the ringer. I didn't want to see the messages I knew weren't coming. Didn't want to face the reality that not one member of my family had reached out to check if I was okay, if I had somewhere to go, if I was even alive. The letter from my grandmother felt like it was burning a hole in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out for the third time that night, unfolding the creased pages carefully in the harsh fluorescent light. The paper was thick and expensive, the kind of stationery that spoke of a different era, when letters mattered and words were chosen with care. My grandmother, Kira Delacroix, had been the strongest woman I'd ever known. She'd raised my father, alone after my grandfather died in a fishing accident, had built the vineyard from nothing but raw land and stubborn determination. She'd taught me to see beauty in old things, to understand that preservation wasn't about clinging to the past, but about honoring what was worth saving. When she died, it felt like losing my compass, the one person who truly understood why I did what I did. But even in death, she was still protecting me. I read the letter again, focusing on the legal language she'd included alongside her personal words. The deed to the house had been transferred to my name on my 25th birthday, 3 years ago, though I'd never known it. She'd arranged it quietly through her attorney, ensuring that while my parents could continue living there, the house itself belonged to me. The language was clear and unambiguous, backed by county records and notarized documents that would hold up in any court. My parents had spent 3 years living in my house, planning my sister's wedding at my property, building their comfortable life on land that legally belonged to me. And tonight, they'd stood on my porch and told me I wasn't welcome. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. Almost. My phone buzzed against the nightstand, and for a moment my heart leaped with the ridiculous hope that someone from my family had come to their senses. But the number on the screen was unfamiliar, a local area code I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "Kira, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours." The voice was warm, concerned, completely unexpected. It took me a moment to place it. Ezra Castellanos worked for the architectural firm that had partnered with mine on the Seattle project. He was a structural engineer, brilliant and methodical, with the kind of quiet confidence that made complex problems seem solvable. We'd worked together for 2 weeks, long days turning into longer conversations over coffee and takeout, and I'd found myself looking forward to our meetings in ways that had nothing to do with work. "I heard what happened," he said, and I could picture him running his hand through his dark hair the way he did when he was worried. "From Margaret at the firm. She said your family. She said there was some kind of situation." I closed my eyes, embarrassed that word had already gotten out, that my professional colleagues were discussing my personal disaster. "Margaret talks too much. She's worried about you. We all are. Where are you?" "Brookings, some motel that looks like it hosts more drug deals than family vacations." "Jesus, Kira, you can't stay there." "It's fine. It's just for tonight." But even as I said it, I realized I had no idea what tomorrow would bring, where I would go, what I would do. My apartment in Portland was a sublet that had ended when I took the Seattle job. My savings account could cover a few weeks of motel rooms, but then what? "Listen to me," Ezra said, his voice taking on the tone he used when he was solving a structural problem. "I have a place in Portland, a house I inherited from my aunt. It's been sitting empty for months while I figure out what to do with it. You could stay there as long as you need. I can't. Yes, you can, and you will, because sleeping in Fleabag motels isn't going to solve anything, and I'm not letting someone I care about disappear into some downward spiral because her family are idiots. Someone I care about." The words hit me unexpectedly, warming something inside me that had been cold since I'd walked out of my childhood home. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that someone, anyone, gave a damn about what happened. To me. "Why?" I asked quietly. "Why what? Why do you care? We barely know each other." There was a pause, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then he said, "Do you remember the day we found those original blueprints in the basement of the Morrison building?" I did remember. We'd been looking for structural documentation when we'd discovered a cache of architectural drawings from the 1920s, perfectly preserved and incredibly detailed. I'd gotten so excited I'd nearly knocked over a support beam, and Ezra had spent 20 minutes listening to me explain the historical significance of the window casements while covered in dust and spider webs. "You lit up like Christmas morning," he continued. "Most people would have seen old papers. You saw stories, history, lives that mattered. Anyone who cares that much about preserving beautiful things is worth caring about." I felt tears prick at my eyes, the first ones that had threatened all evening. "Ezra? I'm driving down to get you. Don't argue. Don't tell me you're fine. Just text me the address of that motel and be ready to leave in 3 hours." The line went dead before I could protest. I sat staring at the phone for a long moment, trying to process this unexpected kindness from someone who owed me nothing. Then I typed out the address of the Seaside Motor Inn and hit send. For the first time since I'd walked into my parents' living room, I wasn't alone. While I waited for Ezra, I did something I'd been avoiding. I opened my laptop and began to research. Not my family's accusations, not the mysterious bank transfers that had my name attached to them, but something much more concrete. Property, records for Clatsop County, specifically for 47 Lighthouse Hill Drive, Ashworth Bay, Oregon. The internet connection was spotty, but after 20 minutes of patience and determination, I had what I needed. The deed history for the house stretched back to 1892, when it was first built by a ship captain named Jeremiah Blackwood. It had passed through several families before my great-grandfather bought it in 1958. When he died, it went to my grandmother. And on March 15th, 3 years ago, it had been transferred to me. The document was clear, legal, and filed with the county clerk's office. Elena Delacroix had deeded the property to Kira Delacroix, her granddaughter, as a gift. No mortgage, no lines, no conditions except a life estate allowing my parents to remain in the house as long as they wished. But a life estate could be revoked if the terms were violated, and throwing the actual owner out of her own home certainly seemed like a violation. I screenshot the deed, saved it to my phone, and emailed copies to myself from 3 different accounts. Then I researched real estate law in Oregon, focusing on life estates and the rights of property owners. By the time headlights swept across my motel room window, I had a basic understanding of exactly where I stood legally. It was a much stronger position than my family realized. Ezra knocked softly on the door, and when I opened it, he looked exactly like I'd expected. Concerned, rumpled from the 3-hour drive, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing a jacket that smelled like rain and cedar. His dark eyes scanned my face, cataloging the damage, and I saw his jaw tighten when he noticed whatever he found there, "You ready to get out of here?" he asked. I looked around the depressing motel room one last time, grabbed my bag and nodded. More than ready. The drive to Portland passed in comfortable near silence, punctuated by occasional observations about the late-night radio programming and the way fog looked different when you were driving through it instead of watching it from a window. Ezra didn't push me to talk about what had happened, didn't offer platitudes or advice. He just drove steadily north while I stared out at the dark coastline and tried to figure out what came next. His aunt's house was in the Belmont district, a neighborhood I'd always loved for its mix of restored craftsman homes and quirky local businesses. The house itself was a 1920s bungalow with good bones and neglected details, the kind of place that whispered stories about the lives that had been lived within its walls. She was an artist, Ezra explained as he showed me through the rooms. Painted watercolors, mostly coastal scenes. She left everything exactly as it was, including about 40 years' worth of art supplies. The guest bedroom was small but comfortable, with built-in bookcases and a window that looked out over a garden gone wild. It felt safe in a way the motel room hadn't, like a place where I could think clearly without the constant background hum of other people's misery. "There's food in the kitchen," Ezra said, lingering in the doorway like he wasn't sure whether to stay or go. "Nothing fancy but enough to get you through a few days, and I'm 20 minutes away if you need anything." "Thank you," I said, and the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what he'd done. "I don't know how to—" "You don't have to," he said simply. "Just get some sleep. Everything else can wait until tomorrow." After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room that was temporarily mine. The walls were covered with framed watercolors, soft scenes of Oregon beaches and forests that captured light in ways that made me think of my grandmother's garden. There was something soothing about being surrounded by beauty created by someone who understood the value of preservation, of capturing moments worth keeping. I unpacked my few belongings, took a long shower in the clawfoot tub, and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. My family had cut me out of their lives based on lies, had chosen to believe the worst about me without even considering alternatives. The people who were supposed to know me best had decided I was capable of theft and betrayal, had thrown me out like garbage and felt justified doing it. But lying there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of an unfamiliar house settling around me, I realized something important. I wasn't broken. Hurt? Yes. Angry, absolutely. But not broken. And I had something they didn't know about. Something that gave me power they'd never imagined I possessed. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through windows that faced east, casting everything in golden warmth. I made coffee with beans I found in the freezer, scrambled eggs with cheese that was still good, and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a legal pad. If I was going to fight this, I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting. I started with the bank transfers, the evidence that had been used to convict me in my family's court of opinion. The account number they'd shown me wasn't familiar, but I wrote it down anyway, along with the dates and amounts. $50,000 over 6 months, they'd said. That was a significant amount, enough to seriously impact the vineyard's operations. Then I made a list of everyone who had access to the vineyard's financial systems. My father, obviously. The accountant, Martha Reeves, who'd been handling the books for 15 years. The office manager, Patricia Vance. And Preston, my sister's fiancé, who'd been helping with the business side of wedding planning and had been given temporary access to coordinate vendor payments. Preston, who I'd found in the wine cellar making a tense phone call about money. Preston, who'd asked me not to mention it to Celeste. Preston, who'd somehow convinced my sister that I'd tried to seduce him. I picked up my phone and called Martha Reeves. She'd known me since I was a child, had taught me to balance a checkbook when I was 12 years old. If anyone would give me straight answers, it would be Martha. "Kira, honey," she said when she answered, and her voice was warm but cautious. I heard about... Well, I heard there was some trouble at home. Martha, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Those transfers from the Vineyard account, the ones with my name on them, when were they processed? Oh, sweetheart. I could hear her shuffling papers in the background. I can't really discuss account details over the phone. You understand. I understand that someone used my digital signature to steal money from my family's business, and I need to figure out who. There was a long pause. Then Martha said quietly, "Can you come in? This afternoon, maybe? We should talk in person." After I hung up, I spent an hour researching Preston Beaumont. What I found was interesting. His family's shipping company had been struggling for the past 2 years, losing contracts to larger competitors and dealing with some kind of lawsuit related to environmental violations. His trust fund was real, but it was structured in a way that limited his access to the principal until he turned 35. He was currently 32. Preston needed money, had access to the vineyard's financial systems, and had somehow managed to redirect suspicion onto me. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof. That afternoon, I drove to Ashworth Bay for the first time since I'd been thrown out. The vineyard office was in a converted barn on the property, separated from the main house by a 1/4 mile of gravel road and carefully maintained landscaping. I parked behind the building, hoping to avoid any awkward encounters with my family, and slipped in through the back door. Martha was waiting for me, her gray hair pulled back in the practical bun she'd worn for as long as I'd known her. She was 65, sharp as a tack, and had the kind of memory for numbers that made calculators redundant. She also looked deeply uncomfortable. "I pulled the records," she said without preamble, sliding a folder across her desk. "Those transfers, they were all processed after hours, on weekends mostly, and they were all authorized with your employee code, the temporary one we set up for you during the holidays." I opened the folder and studied the printouts. The pattern was clear once I knew what to look for. Every transfer had been made on days when I could prove I was somewhere else, working in Seattle, attending conferences, visiting friends in Portland. Someone had been using my credentials systematically, counting on my family's willingness to believe the worst about me. "Martha," I said carefully, "who else knew my employee code?" She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Well, your parents, obviously. And I did, in case there were any problems. But I also had to give it to Preston when he was coordinating the wedding vendor payments. He needed to be able to verify the authorized user list." "Preston had my employee code." "Yes, but Kira, I can't believe he would—" "Look at the dates again," I said, pointing to the transfer schedule. "Every one of these transactions happened within 48 hours of Preston being in the office. Check your sign-in log." Martha pulled out another book, one where all visitors to the vineyard office were required to sign in. As she cross-referenced the dates, her face grew pale. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He's been stealing from my family and letting me take the blame. And somehow he convinced Celeste that I tried to seduce him to throw suspicion off himself." Martha stared at the evidence spread across her desk, the clear pattern of theft and misdirection. "What are you going to do?" I thought about my parents. Faces when they'd accused me, about the cold certainty in their voices when they'd told me to leave. I thought about Celeste's wedding in 2 weeks, about the life she was about to build with a man who was robbing her family blind. "I'm going to let Preston hang himself," I said, "and then I'm going to remind my family exactly who owns the ground they're standing on." As I drove away from the vineyard that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. I felt like myself again. Not the broken, rejected daughter who'd fled into the night, but the architect who solved complex problems, who saw patterns others missed, who understood that the strongest structures were built to last. Preston Beaumont had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed that destroying my reputation would be enough, that my family's rejection would send me running so far and so fast that I'd never come back to fight. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. 2 weeks passed before I made my first real move. 2 weeks of careful planning, of building evidence, of letting Preston Beaumont think he'd gotten away with the perfect crime. I'd returned to Portland and thrown myself into work with the kind of focused intensity that my colleagues probably mistook for professional dedication. In reality, it was strategy. During the day, I consulted on historic preservation projects, reviewed architectural plans, and attended meetings about facade restoration and structural integrity. But my evenings belonged to a different kind of construction project. I was building a case, piece by piece, with the same methodical precision I used to restore century-old buildings. Ezra had become my unofficial partner in this endeavor, though he didn't know the full scope of what I was planning. He'd stop by the house most evenings, ostensibly to check on repairs or bring dinner, but really to provide the kind of steady presence that kept me grounded. He never pushed for details about my family situation, never offered unsolicited advice. He just listened when I needed to talk and gave me space when I needed to think. "You're planning something," he said one Thursday evening as we sat on the back porch sharing Thai takeout. "I can see it in the way you've been organizing those files, the way you check your phone every 10 minutes like you're waiting for something." I looked at him over my pad thai, this man who'd driven 3 hours to rescue me from a Fleabag motel and asked for nothing in return. His dark hair was messy from a day spent crawling through the attic of a Victorian mansion, and there was a smudge of dust on his cheek that he hadn't noticed. He looked tired but content, like someone who'd found satisfaction in solving problems that mattered. "Preston's getting married to my sister in 3 days," I said. "The wedding is at the vineyard, with 300 guests and enough flowers to stock a botanical garden, and I'm going to destroy him." Ezra set down his chopsticks and studied my face. "Kira, whatever he did to you, it's not about what he did to me. It's about what he's still doing to my family." I pulled out my phone and showed him the latest bank transfer I'd discovered. He took another $15,000 last week, wedding expenses according to the memo. Except I called the florist, and they were paid months ago. The evidence I'd gathered painted a clear picture of systematic theft. Preston had been siphoning money from the vineyard for almost a year, long before I'd ever helped with the holiday. Bookkeeping. He'd used my temporary access codes as cover, timing his thefts to coincide with periods when I was demonstrably elsewhere. But more than that, he'd been manipulating Celeste, feeding her insecurities about me, convincing her that I was jealous of her happiness. I'd spent hours on the phone with vendors, tracing payments and discovering discrepancies. The wedding? Photographer had been paid twice, once legitimately, and once through a fraudulent invoice that sent money to an account Preston controlled. The catering deposit had been inflated by 30%, with the excess disappearing into the same mysterious account. Even the rehearsal dinner venue had been overcharged, with Preston pocketing the difference. He'd turned my sister's wedding into his personal ATM, and she had no idea. "The wedding's at your family's property," Ezra said slowly. "The property you legally own." "Exactly. Kira." His voice carried a warning I'd never heard before. "Whatever you're thinking of doing, make sure it's justice, not revenge." "What's the difference?" "Justice protects people. Revenge just destroys them." I looked out at the garden, at the way evening light filtered through the overgrown roses and cast everything in shades of gold and amber. In 3 days, Celeste would walk down an aisle lined with white roses toward a man who'd been stealing from her family for months. She'd promised to love and honor someone who'd manipulated her into believing her sister was the enemy. And my parents would watch with pride, never knowing they were witnessing the wedding of their daughter to a thief. "I'm not going to hurt Celeste," I said finally, "but I am going to make sure she knows exactly who she's marrying before it's too late." The next morning, I drove to Salem and met with an attorney named Vivian Cross. She was recommended by Martha Reeves, who'd whispered her name to me during one of our clandestine meetings at the vineyard office. Vivian specialized in family law and property disputes, and she had the kind of reputation that made opposing counsel nervous. Her office was in a converted Victorian house near the Capitol building, all dark wood paneling and floor-to-ceiling, bookshelves that spoke of serious legal scholarship. Vivian herself was in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "So let me make sure I understand," she said when I finished. "You own the property where this wedding is taking place, your family doesn't know you own it, and you have evidence that the groom has been embezzling from your family's business." "That's correct." "And you want to what, exactly? Stop the wedding? Have him arrested?" "I want to give my sister the information she needs to make an informed decision about her future. What she does with that information is up to her." Vivian leaned back in her leather chair and studied me. "Ms. Delacroix, I've been practicing law for 28 years, and I've seen a lot of family disputes. Most of them end badly for everyone involved. Are you sure this is the path you want to take?" "My family threw me out based on lies," I said. "They believed I was capable of theft and betrayal without even asking for my side of the story. Maybe this will end badly, but nothing definitely will." She nodded slowly. "All right, here's what we're going to do." The plan Vivian outlined was elegant in its simplicity. As the legal owner of the property, I had the right to be present at any event taking place there. I couldn't stop the wedding, but I could attend it. And if I happened to have information about the groom's criminal activities, well, that was just unfortunate timing. "The key," Vivian explained, "is documentation. We need everything properly notarized, witnessed, and filed with the appropriate authorities. If this goes badly, and it probably will, we want to make sure you're protected legally." I spent the rest of that day and all of the next gathering final pieces of evidence. I drove to banks, spoke with managers, obtained certified copies of fraudulent transactions. I visited the district attorney's office and filed a formal complaint about the embezzlement, complete with a detailed timeline and supporting documentation. I contacted the vendors who'd been used in Preston's scheme and obtained sworn statements about the fraudulent payments. By Friday evening, the day before the wedding, I had assembled a case that would have made a prosecutor weep with joy. Preston. Beaumont had stolen nearly $80,000 from my family's business over the course of 18 months, using increasingly sophisticated methods to cover his tracks. He'd created fake invoices, inflated legitimate bills, and used my access codes to make it look like I was the culprit. But more than that, I'd discovered the reason for his desperation. The Beaumont family shipping company wasn't just struggling. It was 3 months away from bankruptcy. Preston's trust fund was tied up in legal proceedings related to his father's tax evasion charges. The man my sister was about to marry wasn't just a thief. He was broke, desperate, and running out of options. That night, I sat in the garden behind Ezra's aunt's house and called my grandmother's attorney, the man who'd handled the deed transfer 3 years ago. Harold Blackstone was 83 years old and sharp as a knife, with the kind of legal mind that had been sharpened by decades of complex estate planning. "Kira, my dear," he said when he heard my voice. "I was wondering when you'd call. I heard about the unpleasantness with your family. News travels fast in Ashworth Bay." "It does indeed, and I assume you're calling because you've finally read your grandmother's letter carefully. I own the house. You do. Have for 3 years now. Your grandmother was very specific about her wishes. She wanted to make sure you had security, a place that could never be taken from you. She was quite concerned about your parents' tendency to, how did she put it? Mistake volume for validity." I laughed despite everything. That sounded exactly like something my grandmother would say. "Harold, If I wanted to exercise my rights as property owner during an event at the house, what would be the legal procedure? Well, that would depend on what kind of event and what kind of rights. Are we talking about a simple visit or something more dramatic? I'm thinking about attending my sister's wedding tomorrow. The wedding that's taking place in my backyard without my permission. There was a long pause. Oh, my dear girl, your grandmother would be so proud. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect Oregon autumn day that made photographers weep with joy. I stood at the window of the guest bedroom, looking out at a garden that had finally begun to show signs of my care. I'd spent the past weeks pulling weeds and pruning roses, finding a kind of peace in the rhythmic work of restoration. Today, I was going to put that same principle to work on my family. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue dress that was elegant but not attention-grabbing, professional but not cold. I wanted to look like someone who belonged, someone who had every right to be wherever she chose to be. My grandmother's pearl necklace completed the outfit, a touch of family history that felt like armor. Ezra knocked on the door at exactly 10 o'clock, as we'd arranged. He was wearing a dark suit that made his shoulders look broader and his eyes look darker, and he carried a small bouquet of white roses. "For courage," he said, handing me the flowers. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked. "It's going to get ugly. Then you shouldn't have to face it alone." We drove to Ashworth Bay in comfortable silence, the coastal highway stretching out before us like a promise. The closer we got to my childhood home, the more my heart rate increased. But it wasn't fear I was feeling. It was anticipation. The vineyard was transformed. White tents dotted the grounds like elegant mushrooms, connected by paths lined with flickering lanterns. A string quartet played softly near the gazebo where Celeste would take her vows, and servers in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. It looked like something from a magazine, perfect and beautiful and expensive. Very expensive. I wondered how much of Preston's stolen money had paid for this fairy tale. I parked at the far edge of the property, near the service road that led to the old barn. From there, Ezra and I could walk to the main house without being immediately noticed by the wedding guests who were already beginning to arrive. "Last chance to change your mind," Ezra said as we approached the crowd. "Not a chance in hell." The first person I saw was my mother, resplendent in a pale gold dress that complemented her dark hair. She was directing the placement of floral arrangements with the kind of military precision she'd always brought to social events. When she turned and saw me walking up the path, her face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they weren't so painful. Surprise, confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear. "Kira." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I'm attending my sister's wedding," I said pleasantly. "It's a beautiful day for it, don't you think?" "You weren't invited." "Actually, I was. By the owner of the property." I smiled, the expression feeling sharp on my face. "That would do me." My mother's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" Before I could answer, my father appeared at her side, his expression thunderous. "I told you to stay away from this family," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I told you that you'd made a mistake," I replied evenly. "Today, you're going to find out just how big a mistake it was." A small crowd was beginning to gather, wedding guests drawn by the obvious tension between the bride's family and the unexpected guest. I recognized some of them, family friends, business associates, people who'd known me since I was a child. Their faces showed varying degrees of confusion and curiosity. "You need to leave," my father said, stepping closer. "Now, before I call security." "Go ahead," I said, pulling out my phone. "Call the police, too. I'd love to explain to them why you're trying to have the legal owner of this property arrested for trespassing." My father's mouth fell open. Behind him, I could see Tristan, approaching with his characteristic swagger, his face already arranged in an expression of disdain. But as he got close enough to hear what I'd said, his steps faltered. "What did you say?" my mother asked, her voice barely audible. I reached into my purse and pulled out the notarized copy of the deed that Vivian had prepared for me. "I said I own this property. The house, the land, the vineyard, all of it. Grandmother left it to me 3 years ago, and it's been legally mine ever since." The silence that followed was complete. Even the string quartet seemed to pause between notes. My parents stood frozen, staring at the document in my hands as if it were a bomb that might explode at any moment. "That's impossible," Tristan said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Actually, it's very possible, and very legal. Would you like me to read the relevant sections aloud, or would you prefer to examine the county records for yourself?" "Kira, what's going on?" I turned to see Celeste approaching, radiant in her wedding dress, her face glowing with happiness and confusion. She looked like a princess from a fairy tale, all silk and lace and dreams of happily ever after. Behind her, Preston walked with the confident stride of a man who believed he'd won everything. Seeing him again, knowing what I knew about him, made my stomach turn. He was handsome in that generic way that looked good in family Christmas cards, with the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. Today, that smile faltered when he saw me, and for just a moment, I caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating behind his pleasant facade. "Hello, Celeste," I said gently. "You look beautiful." "Thank you, but—" "What are you doing here?" Mom said. She trailed off, looking between our parents and me with growing confusion. "I'm here because this is my home," I said simply. "And because there's something you need to know about your fiancé." Preston stepped forward, his hand moving protectively to Celeste's arm. "Celeste, honey, we talked about this. Your sister has been having some difficulties lately. Maybe we should—" "Actually, Preston," I interrupted, "I think Celeste should hear about your difficulties. Like the $80,000 you've stolen from her family's business over the past 18 months. The words hung in the air like poison gas. I watched Preston's face cycle through emotions: shock, fear, anger, and finally, desperate calculation. Celeste just stared at me as if I'd started speaking in tongues. "That's ridiculous," Preston said, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. "Celeste, you know your sister has been making wild accusations." "I have documentation," I said, pulling out the folder Vivian had prepared. "Bank records, fraudulent invoices, witness statements. Would you like me to start with the fake catering bills, or should we go straight to the phantom photography payments?" I began reading from the documents, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. Account numbers, dates, amounts. The systematic way Preston had used my access codes to cover his tracks. The fake vendor invoices he'd created to siphon money from the wedding budget. The way he'd manipulated the books to make it look like I was the thief. With each revelation, I watched Celeste's face change. The glow of happiness faded, replaced by confusion, then dawning horror. She looked at Preston as if seeing him for the first time, and I could practically see her memories rearranging themselves, fitting this new information into the pattern of their relationship. "Preston?" she said quietly. "Is this true?" "Baby. You can't believe— Is it true?" The silence stretched out like a held breath. Preston looked around at the circle of faces surrounding him, all of them waiting for his answer. Wedding guests, family members, business associates, people who would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. "I can explain," he said, finally, and that was as good as a confession. Celeste took a step backward, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. The sound she made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob, the kind of noise that comes from the soul when it realizes it's been betrayed. "You let them blame me," I said to Preston, my voice still calm, still controlled. "You let my family throw me out of my own home based on lies you created. You were willing to destroy my life to cover up your crimes." "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," Preston said desperately. "I just needed time to pay it back, to fix things. My family's company, we had some setbacks." "Your family's company is bankrupt," I said, "and your trust fund is frozen due to your father's legal troubles. You need money so badly you were willing to steal from the woman you claim to love." Celeste was crying now, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "How long?" she asked. "How long have you been lying to me?" Preston reached for her, but she jerked away from his touch. "Celeste, please let me explain." "How long?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Because the truth was, Preston had been lying from the beginning. About his finances, about his feelings, about his intentions. He'd seen the Delacroix family as a solution to his problems, and he'd been willing to do whatever it took to access their money. "I loved you," he said finally. And even he seemed to realize how hollow it sounded. Celeste looked at him for a long moment. This man she'd planned to marry. This man she'd defended against her own sister. Then she reached up and pulled off her engagement ring, a massive diamond that had probably cost more than most people made, in a year. "Get out," she said quietly. "Celeste, get out of my sight. Get off this property, and if you ever contact me again, I'll have you arrested." Preston looked around the circle of faces one more time, perhaps hoping to find an ally, someone who might still believe his lies. But there was nothing there except disgust and contempt. He turned and walked away, his confident stride reduced to the defeated shuffle of a man whose carefully constructed world had just collapsed around him. The wedding guests began to disperse, murmuring among themselves, probably already composing the stories they'd tell about the day they witnessed a bride discover her groom was a thief. The caterers looked uncertain about whether to continue serving champagne. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely. In the sudden quiet, my family stood in a small cluster, looking at me like they'd never seen me before. My mother was still pale, clutching the deed document like it might provide some explanation for how their world had shifted so dramatically. My father looked older than I'd ever seen him, the weight of his mistake written clearly across his face. "Kira," Celeste said, her voice small and broken. "I'm so sorry." I looked at my sister, at this woman who'd believed the lies about me, who'd chosen to trust a stranger over her own blood. Part of me wanted to make her hurt the way I'd hurt, wanted to throw her apology back in her face and watch her crumble. But seeing her standing there in her ruined wedding dress, her dreams shattered and her trust destroyed, I found I couldn't do it. She'd been a victim too, manipulated by someone who saw her family's love as a weakness to exploit. "I know you." I said gently, "and I forgive you." The words seemed to break something in her, and she started crying harder, deep sobs that shook her entire frame. I stepped forward and put my arms around her, holding my sister while she grieved for the life she'd thought she was going to have. Over her shoulder, I looked at my parents. These people who'd raised me, who'd thrown me out, who were now confronting the magnitude of their mistake. My father's hands shook as he reached for my mother, seeking comfort in the ruins of their certainty. "We need to talk," I said quietly. "All of us. About a lot of things." But that conversation would have to wait. Today was supposed to be about celebration, about new beginnings and happy endings. Instead, it had become about truth, about the way lies could poison everything they touched, about the cost of choosing to believe the worst about the people you claim to love. As I held my sister and watched my parents struggle to process what they'd learned, I realized that this moment wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Not the beginning Celeste had planned, not the vindication I'd imagined, but something more complex and more real. We were a family that had been broken by lies and betrayal. Now we had the chance to build something better, something based on truth instead of assumption, on love instead of fear. Whether we'd take that chance remained to be seen. The aftermath of a shattered wedding has its own particular kind of chaos. Guests wandered the vineyard grounds in small clusters, their voices carrying a mixture of shock and barely contained excitement. Some were already heading for their cars, eager to escape the awkwardness. Others lingered near the bar, fortifying themselves for the long drive home and the phone calls they'd make once they got there. I stood with Celeste on the porch of what I was still learning to think of as my house, watching the controlled dissolution of what should have been the happiest day of her life. She'd changed out of her wedding dress into jeans and a sweater, but her hair was still elaborately arranged, held in place with pearl pins that caught the afternoon light. The contrast between her casual clothes and formal hairstyle made her look younger, more vulnerable. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. It was a fair question, and one I didn't have a complete answer to. The immediate crisis had passed. Preston was gone, presumably back to whatever hole he'd crawled out of. The wedding guests were dispersing. The catering staff was packing up $300 worth of uneaten cake. But the larger questions, the ones about family and forgiveness, and how we moved forward from here, those were more complicated. "Now we figure out how to be a family again," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it was possible. Celeste nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She'd built her adult life around the assumption that I was the problem, the jealous sister who couldn't stand to see her happy. Having that foundation ripped away left her with nothing solid to stand on, no framework for understanding who she was or what she wanted. My parents had retreated to the kitchen, ostensibly to coordinate the cleanup, but really to give themselves space to process what they'd learned. Through the window, I could see them sitting at the breakfast table where I'd eaten countless bowls of cereal as a child, their heads bent close together in urgent conversation. 24 hours ago, they'd been the wronged parents, justified in their decision to cut their wayward daughter from their lives. Now they were the ones who'd made a catastrophic mistake, who'd chosen to believe lies over love. Ezra appeared, beside me carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of expression that suggested he'd been dealing with logistics while I'd been dealing with emotions. "The caterers want to know about payment," he said quietly. "And there are about 50 floral arrangements that someone needs to decide what to do with." "Send the flowers to the hospital," I said. "The children's ward. As for the caterers..." I looked at Celeste. Did Preston already pay them? I thought he did. But now I don't know what to believe about anything he told me. I pulled out my phone and called Martha at the vineyard office. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with anxiety. "Kira, honey, I heard what happened at the wedding. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Martha. But I need you to do something for me. Can you check the accounts and see if the catering bill for today was paid?" I could hear her fingers clicking on keyboard keys. "Let's see. There's a payment to Coastal Catering from last month, but it's marked as a deposit. The balance of $8,000 is still outstanding." Of course it was. Preston had probably pocketed the money that was supposed to cover the final payment, assuming he'd be long gone by the time anyone noticed. I thought about my parents, about the financial strain the vineyard had been under because of Preston's theft, about the way they'd been struggling to make ends meet while he'd been bleeding them dry. "Martha, I'm going to transfer some money to cover the catering bill. Can you handle that from your end?" "Of course, but Kira, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. This is my family, and this is my property. I'll take care of it." After I hung up, Celeste was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're going to pay for my wedding? Even after everything that happened?" "I'm going to pay for the catering so the staff can go home and feed their own families. What we call it doesn't matter." She was quiet for a long moment, looking out, over the vineyard where white tents were being dismantled and folding chairs were being stacked. "I don't understand you," she said finally. "I believed horrible things about you. I chose him over you. And you're still here, still helping." Why? It was a question I'd been asking myself since I'd held her while she cried. Why had I forgiven her so easily? Why was I paying for her ruined wedding? Why was I still trying to protect a family that had thrown me away? Because you're my sister, I said simply. And because Preston manipulated you just as much as he manipulated everyone else. You were his victim too. But I should have known better. I should have seen through him. Maybe, but love makes us stupid sometimes. It makes us want to believe the best about people, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. Celeste laughed, a sound that was half humor and half hysteria. Mom always said you were too smart for your own good. I used to think she meant it as an insult, but I'm starting to realize it was just observation. Inside the house, I could hear my parents' voices rising, their conversation becoming more heated. Through the kitchen window, I saw my father stand. Up abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. My mother was crying, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. "They're fighting about me," I said. "They're fighting about themselves," Celeste corrected. "About the choice they made, about what it says about them as parents. Dad keeps saying he was protecting the family, and Mom keeps saying she should have known better." "And what do you think?" Celeste was quiet for so long I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "I think we all got exactly what we deserved. You deserved a family that trusted you enough to ask questions before passing judgment. Mom and Dad deserved a daughter who gave them the benefit of the doubt. And I deserved a fiancé who wasn't a criminal. But none of us got what we deserved. No, we got what we chose, and now we have to live with those choices." The front door opened and Tristan stepped out onto the porch. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past few hours, his usual swagger replaced by something that resembled actual humility. "Mom and Dad want to talk to you," he said to me. "Both of you." We found them in the living room, the same room where they'd confronted me 3 months ago with their accusations and their ultimatum. But the dynamic was completely different now. They sat close together on the sofa, holding hands like they were bracing for impact. My father's face was red and blotchy, and my mother's eyes were swollen from crying. "Sit down," my father said, but his voice lacked the authority it had carried before. Now he sounded like a man who'd lost the right to give orders. Celeste and I took the chairs across from them, the same seating arrangement as before, but with the roles reversed. Now they were the ones being judged, the ones who had to explain themselves. "We owe you an apology," my mother began, her voice barely above a whisper. "What we did to you, what we believed about you, it was unforgivable. You threw me out of my own house," I said, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because the truth needed to be acknowledged. You believed I would steal from my own family, that I would try to seduce my sister's fiancé. You chose to think the worst possible things about me without ever asking for my side of the story. My father flinched as if I'd struck him. "We were wrong, completely, utterly wrong, and I don't know how to fix that." "You can't fix it," I said. "What's done is done. The question is what we do now." "What do you want to do?" my mother asked. "With the house, with the vineyard, with us?" It was the question I'd been dreading because I wasn't sure I knew the answer. 3 months ago, I would have done anything to get my family back, to restore the relationships that had defined my entire life. But I wasn't the same person who'd been thrown out that night. I'd learned to stand on my own, to build a life that didn't depend on their approval. I'd discovered that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, more resilient than they'd given me credit for. "I want to understand why," I said finally. "Why you were so ready to believe the worst about me. Why Preston's word carried more weight than mine. Why you never once considered that maybe, just maybe, I was telling the truth." The silence that followed was heavy with decades of unspoken resentments and misunderstandings. My father ran his hands through his hair, looking older and more defeated than I'd ever seen him. "You were always different," he said finally. "From the time you were little, you saw things differently, questioned things the rest of us accepted. You were brilliant and stubborn and completely certain of your own opinions, and sometimes that made you difficult to live with." "Different doesn't mean dishonest," I said. "No, it doesn't. But it made you unpredictable. When Preston came to us with his accusations, when he showed us those bank records with your name on them, it seemed like the kind of thing you might do if you were angry enough, if you felt like we didn't appreciate you. You thought I would steal from you out of spite? We thought you might take what you felt was owed to you," my mother said quietly. "You always said the vineyard wasn't your world, that you had your own path. We thought maybe you'd decided to claim your inheritance early." I stared at them, these people who'd raised me but had never really understood me. They'd seen my independence as rejection, my different choices as a judgment on their lives. And when someone came along with a plausible explanation for why their difficult daughter might betray them, they'd been ready to believe it. "I never wanted your money," I said. "I just wanted your respect." "You had it," my father protested. "You have it." "Do I? Because 3 months ago you were willing to believe I was a thief and a homewrecker based on the word of a man you'd known for less than 2 years. That doesn't sound like respect to me." Celeste shifted in her chair, and I could see her struggling with her own guilt. "I told them about the conversation in the wine cellar," she said. "I told them you tried to kiss Preston, that you said he was making a mistake marrying me." "And you believed him when he told you that?" "I wanted to believe him. I was so insecure about our relationship, so worried that he was too good for me. When he said you were jealous, that you'd tried to sabotage our engagement, it gave me someone to blame for all my doubts. So you chose him over me. I chose what felt easier. Blaming you was simpler than examining why I didn't trust my own fiancé." The honesty in her voice was painful, but necessary. We were finally having the conversations we should have had months ago, before the lies and accusations had poisoned everything between us. "Where do we go from here?" Tristan asked. He'd been quiet during most of the conversation, but now he looked genuinely concerned about the answer. "I mean, what happens to the family? To the vineyard? To all of us?" I looked around the room, at these people who'd shaped my entire life, who'd failed me catastrophically, but who were still, despite everything, my family. I thought about the house I legally owned, the vineyard that had been struggling financially, the complex web of relationships and responsibilities that bound us together. "I have some conditions," I said finally. My father straightened, his businessman instincts kicking in. "What kind of conditions?" "First, I want a full accounting of everything Preston stole. Every penny, every false invoice, every fraudulent transaction. I want to know exactly how much damage he did." "Martha's already working on that," my mother said. "Preliminary estimates put it at around $90,000. Second, I want changes to how the vineyard operates. New financial controls, better oversight, multiple signatures required for large expenditures. We can't let something like this happen again." "Agreed," my father said immediately. "Third, I want honesty. No more assumptions, no more choosing. To believe convenient lies over inconvenient truths. If you have a problem with something I've done, you come to me directly. No more trials in absentia." "Of course," my mother said, but I could see the effort it cost her to make that promise. "And fourth, I want Preston prosecuted to the full extent of the law. What he did wasn't just theft. It was a systematic campaign to destroy my reputation and tear this family apart. That can't go unpunished." The silence that followed was different from the others. This wasn't the silence of shock or shame, but of consideration. They were weighing what I'd asked for, measuring it against what they were willing to give. "What about the house?" Celeste asked finally. "What about it? Are you going to make us leave?" I looked around the living room, at the furniture that held a lifetime of memories, at the walls that had witnessed countless family moments, both happy and heartbreaking. This house had been my grandmother's gift to me, her way of ensuring I'd always have a place to belong. But it had also been my family's home for over 30 years, the foundation of their lives together. "You can stay," I said. "But things are going to be different. This is my house, legally and practically. I'll be involved in decisions about maintenance, renovations, major changes, and I'll be spending time here regularly, whether you like it or not." "We'd like it," my mother said quickly. "We want you to come home." "This is my home," I corrected gently. "It always has been. But home isn't just a place, it's a relationship, and we're going to have to rebuild that relationship from the ground up." My father nodded slowly. "What do you need from us to make that happen?" "Time," I said. "Trust. And the willingness to see me as I actually am instead of who you think I should be." "And what about forgiveness?" my mother asked. Her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear her. I looked at her, this woman who'd raised me, who'd comforted me through childhood nightmares and celebrated my achievements, who'd also chosen to believe the worst about me when it mattered most. Forgiveness wasn't something I could manufacture. On command wasn't a switch I could flip to make the hurt disappear. "I'm working on it," I said honestly. "But forgiveness is something that happens over time, through actions, not words. You'll have to earn it." "How?" my father asked. "By being the parents I always needed you to be. By choosing to trust me even when it's hard. By standing by me the way I needed you to stand by me 3 months ago." The conversation continued. For another hour, working through practical details and emotional logistics. We talked about the vineyard's finances, about Preston's criminal charges, about how to rebuild relationships that had been shattered by mistrust and manipulation. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when old resentments surfaced, when voices were raised and harsh truths were spoken. But we kept talking, and that, I realized, was what we should have done 3 months ago. As the sun began to set over the vineyard, casting long shadows across the grounds where Celeste's wedding should have been celebrated, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not happiness exactly, but hope. Hope that we could find our way back to each other. Hope that we could build something better than what we'd had before. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be legal proceedings as Preston faced the consequences of his crimes. There would be difficult conversations as we worked through years of misunderstandings and hurt feelings. There would be setbacks and arguments and moments when we all wondered if it was worth the effort. But we were family. Broken, flawed, human family. And sometimes, that was enough to build on. As I prepared to leave that evening, driving back to Portland with Ezra beside me and a folder of legal documents in my bag, I realized that this day hadn't ended the way any of us had expected. Celeste's wedding had been destroyed, but something else had been born in its place. Not a return to the way things used to be, but the possibility of something new, something better, something real. The reckoning had begun, and now came the hardest part of all, learning how to be a family again. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my grandmother's house, watching steam rise from my coffee cup as morning light filtered through windows I'd recently had restored. The original glass had been replaced with period-appropriate panes that caught the coastal light exactly the way the architect had intended in 1892. It was the kind of detail most people wouldn't notice, but it mattered to me. Authenticity always mattered. The house felt different now that I'd moved back in. Not completely different, but subtly changed, like a song played in a different key. My parents had relocated to the smaller guest cottage on the property, an arrangement that gave us all the space we needed while keeping the family close. It had taken weeks to negotiate that transition, countless conversations about boundaries and expectations, and who was responsible for what. But we'd figured it out, one awkward discussion at a time. Ezra appeared in the doorway, his hair still, messy from sleep, carrying architectural plans under one arm, and wearing the kind of satisfied expression that came with solving complex structural problems. "The contractor called," he said, kissing my cheek as he passed. "They can start on the barn renovation next month." The barn project had become my latest obsession, converting the old storage building into a combination workshop and office space where I could base my architectural practice. It made sense financially and practically, but more than that, it felt like reclaiming something that had always belonged to me. The vineyard property was large enough to support multiple enterprises, and my preservation work complemented the agricultural business in ways that benefited both. "Any word from the district attorney's office?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Preston's case had been moving through the legal system with the slow inevitability of a glacier, complicated by his family's connections and their battery of expensive lawyers. "Vivian called yesterday. They're pushing for a plea bargain, but she thinks we can get full restitution plus jail time. His father's company officially declared bankruptcy last week, so there's no family money left to hide behind." Preston. Beaumont had become a cautionary tale in Ashworth Bay's social circles, the golden boy who'd fallen from grace so spectacularly that his name was now synonymous with betrayal and greed. I should have felt satisfaction about his downfall, but mostly I felt tired. Revenge, it turned out, was exhausting work that left everyone diminished. My phone buzzed with a text from Celeste. "Coffee in 20 minutes? I have news." Over the past months, my relationship with my sister had evolved into something completely new. Not the easy camaraderie of childhood, but the more complex friendship of two adults who'd learned painful lessons about trust and assumption. She'd started therapy after the wedding disaster, working through years of insecurity and people-pleasing behavior. I'd started it too, dealing with my own issues around family dynamics and the way childhood patterns could poison adult relationships. We met at Harbor Grounds, the coffee shop that had become our neutral territory for difficult conversations. Celeste looked better than she had in months, her color returned and her eyes clear. She'd cut her hair shorter, traded her designer wardrobe for clothes that actually suited her personality, and stopped wearing the kind of makeup that looked like armor. "I got the job," she said before I'd even sat down. "The one in Seattle?" "Museum curator, specializing in Pacific Northwest maritime history. It's perfect for me, Kira. Actually perfect, not just what everyone expects me to want." I smiled, genuinely happy for her. After Preston's betrayal, Celeste had taken a hard look at her life and realized how much of it had been shaped by other people's expectations. The museum job represented her first major decision made purely for herself, based on her own interests and abilities, rather than what looked good on paper. "When do you start?" "Next month. I'll be commuting from Portland. Initially, but eventually I'll probably move closer to the city." She paused, stirring her latte with unnecessary concentration. "I wanted to talk to you about the house situation before I make that decision." "What about it?" "Mom and Dad are settled in the cottage, but they're not getting any younger. Dad's arthritis has been bothering him more, and Mom mentioned wanting to downsize. I think they're planning to ask if they can move back into the main house." I considered this, weighing practical concerns against emotional ones. The cottage was smaller, but perfectly adequate for two people. The main house had better accessibility features and more space for entertaining. It also held most of their furniture and 30 years of accumulated memories. "What do you think I should say?" "I think you should say whatever feels right to you. It's your house, Kira. You get to decide who lives in it and under what circumstances." The fact that she could say that without resentment or manipulation was a measure of how much we'd both changed. 6 months ago, family decisions had been made through emotional blackmail and unspoken expectations. Now, we actually talked to each other, asked questions, respected each other's autonomy. "I'll think about it," I said. "But honestly, I'm more concerned about you. Are you sure you're ready to start over in a new city?" "I'm sure I'm ready to find out who I am when I'm not trying to be what everyone else wants me to be." We talked for another hour about her job and my business and the strange ways life had rearranged itself since that catastrophic wedding day. When we hugged goodbye, it felt genuine in a way our embraces hadn't for years. That afternoon, I found my parents in the cottage garden, working together to plant bulbs for next spring's display. They'd thrown themselves into gardening with the enthusiasm of people who'd discovered a new language, and the results were impressive. The cottage landscaping had been transformed from practical to beautiful, with carefully planned beds that would provide color from early spring through late fall. "We need to talk," I said, settling onto the garden bench they'd installed under the apple tree. My mother looked up from her tulip bulbs, her face immediately showing the anxiety that still appeared whenever I initiated serious conversations. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, but Celeste mentioned you might be interested in moving back to the main house." My parents exchanged a look that held entire conversations. "We don't want to impose," my father said carefully. "The cottage is perfectly adequate for our needs. But it would be nice to have more space for when Tristan visits, or if we want to host family dinners again," my mother admitted. "And the main house has better heating, which matters more now that we're older." I watched them working in their garden. These people who'd raised me and failed me, and were now trying to find their way back to being the parents I'd needed all along. They looked content, but cautious, happy, but careful not to assume too much. "You can move back in," I said, "but I have conditions." They stopped digging and gave me their full attention. "I want us to have regular family meetings, monthly, at least, where we talk about any issues before they become problems. No more assumptions, no more letting resentments fester until they explode." "Agreed," my father said immediately, "and I want joint decision-making on any major changes to the property, new landscaping, renovations, even redecorating. This is still my house, but it's your home. We need to find ways to respect both of those truths." "Of course," my mother said. "What else?" "I want Sunday dinners to become a regular thing again. Not every week, but regularly. All of us, including Ezra when he's available. I want us to remember how to be a family." My mother's eyes filled with tears, the good kind this time. "I'd love that. And I want honesty. Real honesty. Not the polite kind where we all pretend everything's fine when it's not. If something's bothering you, say so. If you disagree with the decision I've made, tell me. We're too old and have been through too much to keep playing games." "That might be the hardest condition," my father said, but he was smiling. "Probably. But it's also the most important one." We spent the rest of the afternoon working in the garden together, planning where to plant next year's vegetables and discussing whether to add a greenhouse for year-round growing. It felt normal in a way that would have been impossible 6 months ago, when every conversation was loaded with unspoken accusations and ancient grievances. That evening, Ezra and I walked down to the beach, following the path my grandmother had worn smooth over decades of sunset strolls. The Oregon coast in autumn was spectacular. All dramatic skies and crashing waves and the kind of raw beauty that made you understand why people wrote poetry. "So they're moving back in," Ezra said, skipping a stone across the foam. "They're moving back in." "How do you feel about that?" "Good, mostly. A little nervous. We've all changed, but change is fragile. It's easy to slip back into old patterns when you're living in the same space where those patterns were formed. But you have safeguards now, communication systems, boundaries that didn't exist before." I nodded, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the water in its eternal rhythm. We'll figure it out. We're all committed to making it work this time. And if it doesn't work, if the old dynamics reassert themselves, then we'll deal with that too. But I'm not the same person who got thrown out 6 months ago, and they're not the same people who threw me out. We've all learned things about ourselves and each other that can't be unlearned. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the waves and breathing salt air that tasted like home. The beach was empty except for a few seagulls and the occasional piece of sea, glass that caught the fading light. "I've been thinking about something," Ezra said eventually. "What's that?" "About us. About what we want our future to look like." I stopped walking and turned to face him, my heart suddenly beating faster. "What about our future?" "I love you, Kira. I love your strength and your stubborn determination and the way you see beauty in things other people want to tear down. I love that you fought for your family even when they didn't deserve it, and I love that you've learned to fight for yourself too." "I love you too," I said, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what I felt. "Then marry me," he said simply. "Not because we need to prove anything to anyone, not because it's what people expect, but because I want to build a life with you that's as solid and beautiful as the buildings you restore." I looked at this man who'd driven 3 hours to rescue me from a terrible motel, who'd offered his home without expecting anything in return, who'd stood by me through family drama and legal proceedings and the messy work of rebuilding broken relationships. He wasn't asking me to be someone different or better or more acceptable. He was asking me to be exactly who I was, but to be it with him. "Yes," I said, and the word felt like coming home. A year later, we held our wedding in the garden behind, the house on Lighthouse Hill Drive. It was small and simple, with white roses from my grandmother's restored beds and string lights that turned everything golden as the sun set over the Pacific. My parents walked me down the aisle together, and Celeste stood as my maid of honor, radiant in a dress she'd chosen herself. Tristan officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion, and his ceremony was surprisingly heartfelt. Preston Beaumont was serving 18 months in minimum security prison and paying restitution that would keep him broke for the foreseeable future. We didn't speak his name at the wedding, but his absence felt like a gift, the empty space where toxicity used to be. As Ezra and I exchanged vows we'd written ourselves, promising to choose each other daily and to build something lasting from love and respect and honest communication, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. The betrayal and exile, the slow work of rebuilding trust, the discovery that family wasn't just about blood, but about the choice to keep showing up for each other even when it was hard. The house where I'd grown up, where I'd been rejected and reclaimed, where I'd learned that home wasn't a place but a relationship, glowed with warm light and the laughter of people who'd chosen to love each other despite their flaws and failures. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined 6 months ago, standing in that terrible motel room with nothing but a suitcase and a letter from my grandmother. But it was better than anything I could have planned, richer and more complex and more real than the fairy tale I'd once thought I wanted. As we danced our first dance as husband and wife, with the lighthouse beam sweeping across the garden and the sound of waves providing nature's soundtrack, I realized that sometimes the best stories aren't about getting what you thought you wanted. They're about discovering what you actually needed and having the courage to build it from scratch. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out!